Ban Ki-moon's been talking about a momentum towards a peace conference on Syria. Whether there's actually a momentum towards peace in Syria is quite another thing. We're going to have guests with us live from France, from the UK and also from America. Lots of people wanting to talk about the role that Russia can play in either prolonging this conflict or bringing it to an end. These are our contact details. We're live here on BBC World News. We're also going to be talking about that video where we saw a rebel commander eating the part of a dead soldier's body. Did that give you doubts about whether the rebels should be armed?
People are going to want to know. Let's just say something.
As I was mentioning, if you are on social media as you watch, all of your comments will come straight to me because we're live here on BBC World News. We're going to spend the whole hour talking about Syria. And the first element of this conflict we're going to look at is the possible use of chemical weapons. You may have seen a report this week from the BBC's Ian Panel detailing what may have been a chemical attack in a northern town. Let's just see a little bit of Ian's report.
A helicopter was spotted high above the town. Eyewitnesses allege at least 2 canisters were dropped from it. They say it was shortly after they landed that casualties started to arrive at Sarakeb Hospital. 8 people were admitted, apparently with similar symptoms. They appear to be vomiting with breathing problems. The worst affected was Mariam Khatib. Relatives claim a device had landed in her garden. Videos appear to show her unconscious with constricted pupils. Doctors who treated her claim she had signs of exposure to chemical agents. The mother of 8 died later that day. Her daughter lies nearby. Her tongue appears distended. She's frothing at the mouth. She, like most of the victims, responded to treatment. Her sons were also on the scene and say they had to be treated. Again, they apparently suffered respiratory and vision problems and appear to have constricted pupils. Mohammed is the eldest son. He says he'd tried to help his mother, but she collapsed in his arms.
Well, let's speak with our first 3 guests on this subject. We have Dr. Ralph Trapp live with us from France, an independent consultant on chemical weapons. Rizgar Nash is from the Centre of Halabja Against Genocide organisation, a student in the UK. And live with us from Indianapolis is Kainan Rahmani, a Syrian-American student there. And Kainan, you were in the part of Syria which Ian was reporting from. When you were there, did people believe that either the rebels or the government were using chemical weapons?
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you to Mr. Panel for his report. When I was in Syria, I was in Sarakeb before the April attack, the chemical weapons attack, but it was well believed throughout the Syrian civilian population that the government had been using chemical weapons. I did not meet a single Syrian civilian to believe that rebels had used any kind of chemical weapons.
So that's the conversations you've had. We should add the Syrian government has denied using these weapons at all. Ralph Trapp, we've had this report from the BBC's Ian Panel. We know from President Obama, who's reiterated again the Americans believe in some circumstances chemical weapons have been used. But we're yet to reach the point where we can talk with any certainty about whether they've been used by either side.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Good afternoon. I mean, your correspondent yesterday spoke of strong but incomplete evidence, and that's probably a fair description of the situation as we have it at this point in time. We have video evidence and we have pictures of weapons that have been used. We also have seen pictures taken in hospitals and in locations where allegedly these chemical weapons have been used. And some of these pictures are shocking, but by themselves, I'm afraid, they show us that something has happened. It can be an organophosphate. It is possible that it was a nerve agent, but the evidence we have so far by itself, I think, is not sufficient to actually be sure that this was a chemical weapons attack and not something else.
And in the case of Ian Panel, he's clearly just reporting the story as best he can. But in the case of America, do you think their reticence to be more categorical is because of Iraq and the fact WMDs were never found?
That probably is one of the factors here, but also I think one has to be careful. The allegations are serious allegations, and the use of chemical weapons is a serious matter. So it's something one can't take lightly, and where you need to have strong evidence to prove the case. This is also eventually a question of criminal liability, of course.
Well, Rizgar, let's bring you in. Unfortunately, you experienced the chemical weapon attack on the city of Halabja in Iraq. Tell us about what you experienced.
Iraqi government started to use a chemical weapon by small portion, started in 1987 till the last big massive attack in the city of Halabja. So for the time 1987 till 1988, there was quite few places who've been attacked. There was small portion. The Iraqi government used different type of tactic to use chemical weapon. As all pictures and videos show, I could feel that the Syrian government or a rebel, whatever who used the chemical weapon in this conflict, it is using exactly similar tactic what Saddam Hussein used in the small villages, small towns, slowly. What we've been experienced was when we used to helping our family, joined our fathers was part of Peshmerga fighting for liberation of our area. We used to be with my family in the valley of Balisan down to.
And Rizgar, what are your memories of experiencing a chemical attack?
Yeah, I mean, when you see the pictures, I mean, the burned skin and eye effect, all those kind of stuff. It is exactly remind me what I saw on when I was facing similar attack from the regime. I think that the sarin gas, when we hailed it, there was an attack on but we've been warned that there will be a smell of very strong apple or some kind of different type of smell will come in. But on the time we've been very lucky and unlucky, because first we've been lucky because our environment and our mountains was helping us to not inhale a lot of the bad smell chemicals. The other thing we've been unlucky with that, we've been trapped in the valley. We couldn't get any help from any international or locals.
Mm-hmm. And of course it took many years to establish exactly what happened in Halabja. Rizgar, thank you very much indeed for coming on to share your experiences. Now let me just pull up a comment here made by Joseph Holliday. He's a former Army intelligence officer who studied the Syrian conflict for the Institute for the Study of War. That's in Washington, D.C. And he was quoted in the New Yorker magazine: "Assad has been extremely calculating with the use of force, increasing the levels of violence gradually so as to not set off alarm bells." Well, I mean, Ralph Trapp, we again should reiterate the Syrian government denies using these weapons, but even the claims which are unproven that we have suggest small-scale uses of chemical weapons. What possible rationale could be behind that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Why would any government, the Syrian government or the rebels or any other force, use chemical weapons in the small amounts that we are seeing if these alleged activities prove to be true?
Well, this is one of the problems with the evidence we have so far, because that is not the way in which chemical weapons are normally used. And also, this is not consistent with the types of weapons that we believe Syria has in its arsenals, which includes things like missiles, multiple rocket launcher warheads, and aerial bombs and things like that. The picture that was shown yesterday that showed this canister dropping from the helicopter, this is not a typical chemical weapon. That looks almost like an improvised device. But at the same time, I would argue that the opposition forces in Syria don't have the capability of producing something like sarin. They may have access to other types of chemicals, but certainly not to nerve agent. So there are a couple of question marks in these stories that need to be cleared up so we understand what's actually going on. If the rationale from a Syrian perspective is to sort of gradually escalate into a larger scale use of chemical weapons in this conflict, that is a possible explanation, of course. Then one needs to remind everybody that the breach of international law starts with the smallest amount already. I mean, use chemical weapons, it doesn't really matter how many of these weapons you do use. It is something that needs to be taken very seriously, and there needs to be a response. So that's why we need proof.
Well, while we're talking here, we've two colleagues from BBC Arabic who are also helping us understand the discussion in the Arab world. They're up in the world's newsroom. Let's see if we can join them live. There they are. Hi to the both of you. What are you seeing coming in through your Facebook page and Twitter and so on?
Well, I think first and foremost, this talk about the use of chemical weapons is being drummed up or played down depending on the political stance of whoever is talking. If you talk to people who support the regime, they always question the proof. What proof have you got? How do you define the material that's being used allegedly? If you are talking to people on the opposite camp, they say all the symptoms that are consistent with use of some sort of a chemical mixture that is yet to be proven, that is yet to be tested, and that's probably what the crucial question, where the crucial question lies. Who is able to say the last word, the definitive answer on whether a chemical weapon has been used, but certainly there has been a use of non-conventional weaponry in certain fights, and the fights are determined by the strategic importance of whatever position each camp is trying to control.
I mean, I've spoken to friends in Syria, and they're mainly in Damascus, and the general sense is the sense of fear. They're asking if the chemical weapons were actually used in other places in Syria, then the possibility of it being used in the war in Damascus is high. And what does that mean? Does that mean intervention, foreign intervention? The possibilities of the use of chemical weapons and what that might mean to the international community is actually terrifying people in Syria. Some of them are actually taking those accusations lightly. They're saying that it's just another way of justifying an intervention in Syria. We're not very worried. I think it's just a way of, justifying, military coming into Syria. Some of them don't take it quite seriously, which is quite strange. But that's the general sense in Syria. It goes between believing that and being terrified of it and actually just ignoring it and saying it's just another way of intervening in Syria.
Both of you, thank you very much. We'll come back and speak to you about the role of Russia in this conflict a little bit later on, thanks to our colleagues there. By the way, if you're watching and want to get in touch with us on Facebook, facebook.com/World Have Your Say, we're on the hashtag WHYS as well. Now let me introduce you to Rona Kadmani, who's lived in Syria for many years and also in northern Iraq. And Rona, you're here in the World's Newsroom with us in London. How do you feel about the accusations and reports of possible chemical attacks in Syria?
I don't believe that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons against the Syrian people. For one thing, the Syrian government and the army are both secular entities, and it would be illogical, irrational for them to use chemical weapons against their secular people. They would be attacking themselves, and this is not logic, and logic speaks.
When you look at the conflict in Syria at the moment, do you think any of it looks particularly logical? We have seen any number of atrocities committed by both sides which suggest logic long departed.
I think the government is very logical in their stance, and they're trying to protect the Syrian people. I think the opposition, whoever they may be, there are a variety of opposition people. I think they are irrational. And especially in their ideology, many of them are extremely irrational, as you can see when you look at the videos.
Saying rational behaviour from the government, irrational behaviour from the rebels. And Kanan, I can see you just shaking your head. A quick comment from you before we take a break.
I mean, I want to know which government rationally goes into the town of Banyas and massacres 1,000 people, and that was condemned by all all parties, including the opposition, the U.S. government, and several others. I was in Aleppo when a TNT barrel was dropped, killing 18 civilians from a Sukhoi fighter jet. That fighter jet obviously did not belong to the opposition, and it killed 18 civilians who were refugees. That is not logical. I was
Kanan and Rona, I'll give you a chance to talk further in a minute. We have to take a brief break here on World Have Your Say. We'll keep talking with the two of you and with Ralph Trapp as well in just a moment. Those of you watching, we're also going to talk about Russia's role. I wonder if you believe that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was quite right to say that if they've got deals with Damascus to deliver arms that were set up before the conflict began, it's quite right that they honour them. We'll be back in a couple of minutes' time.
No, I talking about it. Let me say something. No, I talking about it. Let me say something.
It's no surprise to see a great many of you already engaging with this. The conflict in Syria is probably the single issue that recurs the most in our conversations on World Have Your Say at the moment. Calls coming in from Nigeria, Ghana, Nepal, Spain, Somalia and the Netherlands. Thanks to all of you for getting in touch. I'll work in your comments as best we can. Now let's talk about Russia, because lots of you want to. Dr. Ralph Trapp still with us from France. When you see the amount of diplomatic activity that's happening in Russia, John Kerry, David Cameron, Ban Ki-moon, all going to see the Russians, do you have faith that Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin will make the right decisions on this conflict?
Well, whether or not I have faith in this is perhaps not so important, but I think it is very important, critically important, that Russia gets engaged in this process, and that there is a form of trying to find a solution to the problem, not just on the chemical weapons issue, but in the broader context on the whole issue of the conflict in Syria and the atrocities committed by both sides. You only have to look at the last report of the Independent Commission of Inquiry into Syria of the Human Rights Council of the UN to see what problems we're dealing with here. And so I do hope that this proposed conference will in fact take place in Geneva, and that it will bring some steps towards a process that eventually will resolve the issue.
Rona, let's bring you in on the issue of Russia.
Yes, I think Russia has been involved in the conflict from the very outset. They have said that they want dialogue, and the other opposition parties have refused dialogue.
And Cayman, what about you? Do you have faith that the Russians will play a productive role?
I do not have faith that the Russians will play a productive role. They have used their veto to eliminate any opportunity for the international community to even condemn what the Syrian regime is doing. And the only thing that I think that the international community should be trying to do right now is to pressure Russia to allow at least one resolution in the Security Council, which can allow an independent UN team to investigate the allegations of chemical weapons, which have been proven now, video evidence, soil samples, biopsies of patients. We have abundant evidence, and Russia really needs to be pressured to allow a UN team to investigate those allegations.
Well, at the moment, it looks like the Russians and the Americans are pushing for this peace conference. We don't have a date for it yet. Colin in Scotland's just posted on Facebook saying, good for Russia. How about discussing the weapons America and Britain supply to the rebels in Syria? Well, that's something America and Britain have always denied, though the allegations repeatedly come up. This is something from Carolita. She's in New York. She posts on our Facebook page. People can't just call for Obama every time something happens. Nothing good ever comes from our helpful military activities in the Middle East. I mean, Cayman, I wonder, you're being very critical of the Russians, but do you want to see America, the country you're in, become militarily involved?
Absolutely. I want to see the American government play a productive role in humanitarian protection. We have a responsibility to protect, which is well established under international law, the international community as a whole, not just the United States. And I do believe that when you look at the resolution which was passed in the UN General Assembly and previous resolutions, you can see that the majority of the nations in the world are ready to criticize the Assad regime, and we can probably have a very strong coalition of governments which would be able to intervene to protect the human life in Syria.
Cayman, thank you very much indeed. Alpha has just got in touch through Facebook. He's in Kampala. Thank you very much indeed for getting in touch. America is supporting the rebels in Syria, so it's justifiable to let Russia support Assad's regime. Well, we should add a couple of caveats here. The arms that are going from Russia to Syria, those deals were set up in advance of this conflict. And with regards to the support that America is offering to the rebels, at the moment, it's non-military. However, as I was saying, there are accusations that the Americans are arming the rebels. Nothing official has certainly been agreed. Paul Short is a former director of proliferation and arms control in the UK Ministry of Defence, and he's just joining us as Rona has left us. Paul, welcome to the discussion.
Hello.
Even if the Americans and British were arming the rebels, they wouldn't necessarily tell us at this stage anyway, would they? It would be quite normal for these things to happen without the public seeing in.
Yes, but what is being mentioned, I think, fairly openly, is that the Saudis and Qataris are arming the rebels. So you have Sunni states from the Gulf with an interest in the outcome of this conflict, and they seem to be pretty unrestrained.
And when you hear these reports, a more recent one in the New York Times this week saying the Russians continue to deliver serious military hardware, including anti-ship weaponry, to the Syrian government, they say it's just a deal they cracked. Do you accept that explanation?
Well, there may be a pre-existing deal. I don't accept that it's acceptable international behaviour. The deal was signed before the civil war began, and now the circumstances are different. The world is trying to put concerted pressure on the Syrian regime, and that is undercut if Russia goes on delivering high-tech hardware.
We'll keep on talking with you in a moment, Paul, but we've managed just in the last couple of moments to get through to Dr. Monza Yazgi, a founder of the Union of the Syrian Medical Relief. He's just on the border between Turkey and Syria. Dr. Yazgi, tell me about the people who you've been treating.
We've been treating all kinds of injuries, from gunshot to the heaviest injury, including right now we've seen lately, as I said yesterday at the BBC radio, that we did have some cases from chemical weapons on the border in Idlib. And we have seen cases which never been interacted in medical practice in the past. Even I've been in different areas in the world, including Africa, and we never seen this kind of injury. And with our limited resources, equipment, and support from the international community, we are really having so much difficulties, especially when we come right now to the second phase, I think, which is going to be moving toward using chemical weapons in different states, which we have Syrian physicians in field. They have no idea about these weapons and how to receive this patient, how to isolate them, and how to treat them. And this is what happened last time, which we lost all of them when they came to the hospital. Even we tried to.
Dr. Yazgi, I'm just going to jump in here because I'm doing my best to hear you. On the whole, I am, but sometimes the line's so poor that I'm not able to make out what you're saying. But thank you very much for joining us, saying you're treating a range of different issues. We'll thank you and let you go. Taliso's in New York, just posting on Facebook. I think it's undemocratic to depose a leader through a coup. So indeed, Russia should protect democracy. Lots of people supporting the Russian position. Udo in Nigeria says, more arms shipments from Russia, please. Not everyone tolerates the stench of the so-called West and its allies. And John says, I don't think Russia's doing enough. They should have military bases there. Well, they actually have a naval base there already. One of the reasons Syria is so strategically important. Keep those comments coming in. Facebook.com/World Have Your Say. I'll be back in a couple of minutes' time.
Let me say something.
Hi, I'm Roz Atkins. Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Now, you only have to look at who's visited Russia in recent weeks to understand how crucial it is to try to find a resolution to the Syrian conflict. Ban Ki-moon's been there, John Kerry's been there, David Cameron has been there, and they are all pushing for a peace conference they hope the Syrian government will attend along with the Syrian rebels. Whether that will happen, we'll see, but Ban Ki-moon believes there's a momentum. Let's pull up some of the comments you've been sending in on Russia. Daniel in Zambia says, it's about time Russia stood up for its allies. The West and its media always gloss over the atrocities of the terrorist groups that they support. We'll keep on getting your messages through the WHYS hashtag. Connect you as well with BBC Arabic, all coming up here live on BBC World News.
Talking say something?
Let's go straight up to the world's newsroom and speak to Nahed and Hadia from BBC Arabic. Hi, we're talking about Russia. I wonder what your audience, how it responds to the position the Russians take.
Well, the involvement of the international community, Ross, has always been a strong talking point in the Middle East, in the media, in the social media, as well as in the streets, in cafes. And sometimes this discussion gets so heated, so emotional, people would want the international community to intervene, but they would want them to intervene to the benefit of their own camps. Probably Hadia would shed some more light on this one.
Yes, actually, when you hear comments that come from Syria, it's most of them are quite furious. They're saying, if you're supporting rebels with money, how do you know that they're not going to buy weapons with that money? That's actually some of it might be used against civilians in Syria. They're also saying that supporting rebels is it could actually fuel the war, the civil war in Syria. While others think, no, well, actually, let's support the rebels because the government also has people on its side, like Russia and Iran, for example.
You can sample also some of these discussions on bbcarabic.co.uk, bbc.co.uk/Arabic, that's the website, and you can go to the talking point link there and contribute your views, as well as on Twitter and Facebook as well.
Very interesting for those people watching that who speak Arabic. That is particularly useful. Thank you. We're going to come back in a minute and speak to you about that horrific video of the rebel commander eating the lung of a soldier. I'm curious to know how your audience has reacted to that. We'll be back with you in a moment. Now, still with us live in London is Paul Short, formerly of the Ministry of Defence in the UK. Also Rona Kadmani, who lived in Syria for many years. We'll speak to the both of you in a moment. First, though, Dmitry Babich is here, a political analyst with the Voice of Russia radio station. He's live in Moscow. I'm curious, are your listeners on the whole sympathetic to the position that Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin are taking?
Well, our audience is international, so we have all kinds of views. But a lot of listeners have noticed that just 6 months ago, the Western press was saying that Russia is isolated, that since Mr. Putin came to power, no one wants to talk to him. And suddenly the same people in the Western media are noting that there is David Cameron coming to Moscow, there is Ban Ki-moon coming to Moscow, there is John Kerry coming to Moscow. So obviously the mainstream press got it wrong at least once 6 months ago.
Paul, let's get you talking with Dmitry, because we have to acknowledge, don't we, the power and the influence the Russians have in this scenario.
Yes. If the measurement of Russia's influence in the world is that it can be a blockage to any constructive solution of a situation like Syria, where Russia sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military equipment and has had a client regime for years, if preventing any kind of solution to a civil war in that kind of a country is a measure of Russian influence, well, it has influence. But is that anything one should be proud of?
Dmitry?
Well, first of all of this information about Russian weapons shipments to Syria, we get it from hearsay. I mean, today the New York Times published an article that Russia is supplying anti-ship missiles to Syria, quoting some sources in the US intelligence community. It's enough to look at the map to see that it's impossible for Russia to supply hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment.
Well,
because
you already have.
There is Turkey and there is the EU airspace between us. So it's impossible to do it on a regular basis.
But that
I think
has
what
already
happened
been
is
done.
that the West miscalculated. It expected Mr. Assad to fall down. He didn't fall. And now the West is blaming Russia on that, saying that Mr. Assad is there only thanks to this mythical, huge supplies of Russian arms.
No, that's not the point. The point is you have already supplied, before the Civil War began, but after the Civil War had started, very large air defense systems, which are now a significant factor in all this. And of course, you've sold attack helicopters and jet fighters and heavy artillery, which are used in attacking civilians as well as rebel insurgents.
Well, the problem is that many countries supplied weapons to Arab states. Mr. Assad has been participating in the 14th of July parade in Paris just 2 or 3 years before the civil war started. no one could predict how the events would develop. Everyone expected that there would be, if there can be any war, that this would be a war between Syria and Israel. The fact that there would be a civil war in Syria, I don't think anyone could predict it several years ago.
But once it started, there were attempts to put very strong sanctions on further exports of ammunition and maintenance goods. And Russia has not been prepared to go with those international efforts.
Well, the problem is that arms supplies to the rebels are by far more illegal than Russian arms supplies to the Syrian regime. Just look what's going on. All the world's press is writing about regular supplies of weapons from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from Turkey, for the rebels. I mean, imagine it happening in any other country. What would you say if people were supplying weapons for insurgents inside, I don't know, some European country or even the United States? I don't think anyone would be happy about that.
But the alternative is the
Russia,
rebels are decimated by heavy weapons and have no redress at all and are beaten, and the regime oppressively reimposes its control. Is that better?
Well,
is that what you want?
Yeah, I don't think that's what anyone wants,
well,
but we see that atrocities are being committed on both sides. And certainly I think that shooting people, basically POWs, shooting prisoners of war in the back of their heads is certainly worse than indiscriminate use of force during a fight with the rebels.
Well, in terms
you
of
know,
executing
American
people,
jets might be
people who are being held, we should probably emphasize both sides of this conflict stand accused of that. Paul and Dmitry, let me just interrupt you a little while, because we're talking about the Russian position, which we're understanding better by the day, primarily because of the high-profile guests who have been heading in that direction. Sergei Lavrov and Ban Ki-moon have been meeting today. Sergei Lavrov is the Russian foreign minister. Let's just see a little of what he had to say when he was talking earlier.
We haven't hidden that we supplied Syria with arms per a signed contract, not violating any international agreements, not violating our own laws. It doesn't create any imbalance of power in the region or any kind of advantages in the fight against the opposition.
Well, there is Sergei Lavrov. Let me just read you this message in from David in Croatia. Hi, David. Thanks for watching. He says, Russia and China will always support any regime just to be contrary to the US and Britain. They'll do anything to show how much they object to America. I mean, Rona, you're still with us. Rona Kadmani, do you sometimes feel that Syria has become a pawn as the most powerful countries in the world play out who has the most influence, who has the most control?
Not really. I think Syria stands at is an access point for the West for control. They need to have regime change in Syria, the Western powers, so that they can enlarge the state of Israel, so that they have a major power base in the Middle East. And I think that in taking down the Syrian regime and putting in its place a puppet government, they may well achieve their goal and their aims. If this wasn't so, then why supposedly America cares so much about the Syrian people? Why every time at the UN the annexation and occupation of the Golan Heights, the Syrian people in the Golan who have been very badly treated.
Okay, we're aware of the issue of the Golan Heights. Let's pick up on that issue of hypocrisy, Rona, because you're not the only person to raise this. And Paul, let me put that to you, because even people who are critical of the Syrian government are also keen to highlight what appears to be grand hypocrisy from the Americans and the US and Americans and the UK in terms of who they're prepared to give arms to and who they're prepared to condemn.
Well, let me deal with the last allegation, that this is in some way to do with Western control through strengthening an imperialist Israeli state. Utter nonsense. Most of the commentary points out that although the Israelis and the Syrians don't like each other, Israel was pretty content with the Assad regime. It understood them, it knew what the limits were, and what it's worried about now is the alternative when things may become a kind of quilt of tribal and religious and ethnic violence on its doorstep. This isn't what Israel wants. It isn't what the UK or US has wanted.
This is why the Israelis in the Golan are assisting the rebels and building military hospitals for them in the Golan.
Well, there is a humanitarian imperative as well. But my point is, this is not something that the US or UK or the West in a wider sense chose. It started because, and it's not a coup, as somebody said, it's a civil war which started by the brutal overreaction of the Assad regime against popular demonstrations.
No,
and it's turned into a much bigger, longer...
It's a war by proxy. From the West, it's a war by proxy on the Syrian people.
Do you think that there are hundreds of thousands of insurgents who are fighting the regime are all Westerners? Do you think they are not choosing to resist a terribly bad long-term Ba'athist regime? Where do you think they come from?
Well, I can tell you they come from 23 different countries.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't so, let me ask you this, if it wasn't so and there weren't so many foreigners involved, why is it that they haven't managed to overthrow the Syrian army and the government?
Well, I can answer that. Well, the reason they haven't managed to overthrow is because the Syrian government hasn't managed to quell this rebellion, and the rebels have not managed to overthrow. They are sufficiently close in military power that the two are currently cancelling each other out. Rona, thank you very much indeed. Paul, I'll come back to speak to you in a little while. We're also going to be joined by a couple of other guests, which I'll introduce you to in a moment. Remember, we're live here on World Have Your Say on BBC World News. We're going to talk about that horrific video some of you will have heard about, some of you may even have seen, of a rebel commander eating the lung of a dead soldier. Has that made you change your view of the rebels in Syria and whether you would support them?
No, I absolutely... Talking about it. Let me say something. No, I absolutely... Talking about it. Let me say something.
We spent the whole of this hour on World Have You Say talking about Syria. Let's speak to someone who's there. Isla is a student in Damascus and she joins us live. Isla, thank you for your time today. I'm sure you heard about the video of the rebel commander eating the lung of a soldier, a dead soldier. How did you and your friends react to that? Did it change your view of the rebels?
Yes, of course. The video is all over Facebook and YouTube, and I'm not sure whether it's real or not. Well, it seems real, but like, even if it's not real, you can read the comments on YouTube and they're happy with it. And it's disgusting. I was gonna throw up while I was watching it.
The Free Syrian Army has come out and condemned this and said this has nothing to do with what it stands for, but has it affected your view of the rebels?
Yeah, it made us see the Free Army as worse than worse than they are.
Let's also bring in Haman, who's live with us from Qatar, but is from Daraa in Syria. Haman, your reaction to that video, has it changed your view of the rebels?
Well, actually, it is very important to see the full picture. Only 2 weeks ago, before that incident, more than 100 civilians, between them children, were killed by a knife. And in the city of Banyas, the YouTube full of pics and, of what's happened there in Banyas. None of the big, media has talk about this issue and try to cover up this big incident, this massacre which happened in Banyas. So this is an incident which is done by
Hanan, one moment. I appreciate that.
Does not represent.
Hanan, I'm going to jump in here. Listen, I appreciate that there are many different issues in this conflict which require huge amounts of attention in themselves. But let's just concentrate on this video because it's been one of the biggest stories of the week. Let's bring in my colleagues from BBC Arabic, Nahed and Hadia. I'm absolutely certain this was one of the biggest stories of the week for you.
Ross, I must admit I have not seen that video and I have no plans of seeking to see it. hearing people describe it was a strong enough deterrent for me not to attempt it. However, we need not to forget that parallel to this military war and conflict that's happening in Syria, there is the war of propaganda, and both sides are doing their best in order to kind of prevail in each fight at the time. But also we need to remember that it's the government who has the upper hand in this. They control the airwaves and they control most of the content, sometimes to their own benefit. Who knows?
I have to say here, Nahed, I mean, there's always almost an instant comparison between the behavior of the government soldiers and the behavior of rebels. They're saying that if they're both behaving both violently and in this unhuman way, then what future does that give to Syria? Because people are saying now, well, we don't have a future. They feel sort of hopeless. If this is the violence, I have to say, has affected people's relationships as well. I mean, I know a lot of couples who are engaged to be married who, because of the violence and because of different political opinions, have decided to break up. This is becoming a huge problem to Syrians. You know, the future, what it brings to them. If it's going to be just as violent, then people are obviously rightly feeling hopeless.
And the level of atrocities, Roz, as well, strikes a delicate nerve in my past, because I was brought up in a war-torn country in Lebanon, and I lived the youth and the childhood there, and I know what it is like to fear for your life and for the lives of the ones you love every minute of every day, until there is kind of a lull in the fighting, and then things take off again and you have to learn to cope with them. And these are also the untold stories of this war, and I think we need to pay closer attention somehow to that.
Both of you, we appreciate your contributions on World Have Your Say. I know you'll be back on soon. Ralph Trapp is still with us, as is Dimitri in Moscow. Both of you, a quick comment on that video. It doesn't really matter whether we've seen it or not. We know what was in it. Dimitri, has that affected your view of the rebels, or do you see this as one rogue man?
Well, it certainly made me feel very sad, because I am not a supporter of conspiracy theories, and in the previous argument between Paul and that our colleague from Croatia, I certainly agree with Paul that it has nothing to do with Israel, although Israel somehow for some reason got involved. But certainly I think that between the bad Ba'athist regime and the Islamist fundamentalists who are connected to Al-Qaeda, sorry, I choose the Ba'athist regime because this is an evil that we know. Al-Qaeda fortunately never came to power in any country.
So it's better the devil you know, says Dimitri. I'm just going to interrupt you, Dimitri, to give Ralph a quick 20-second comment on that video.
I haven't seen the video, but what I wanted to say was actually getting back to what your colleague said a minute ago about this war of propaganda, which is waged by either side, really. And fear factor is an important aspect in this context. And this is one of the things that creates fear. It's the same as allegations about the use of chemical weapons. If this becomes a thing that is mentioned again and again and again, people will fear.
Well, I think people are fearing for a whole range of reasons, partly to do with information, partly to do with the threat against their lives, whether they are supporting or opposing the government. Dimitri, Ralph, Isla, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Those of you who have contributed online, we appreciate your contributions too. What Have You Say is on air on BBC Radio in a couple of hours. We'll carry on the discussion then. Goodbye.
Let me say something.